Imagine being told you have 3 days to leave your home forever and deciding to come back anyway. Not once, not for a visit, for the rest of your life. That's exactly what happened after Chernobyl. And the strangest part isn't that people snuck back into one of the most contaminated places on Earth. It's that many of them are still alive today, decades later, in some cases healthier than the neighbors who followed the rules and left. That shouldn't make sense. So why did it happen? On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a botched safety test. Within days, Soviet authorities evacuated over 100,000 people from the surrounding area. Entire towns emptied in hours. Pripyat, the city built for plant workers, went from 50,000 residents to 0 almost overnight. Furniture stayed, photographs stayed, toys stayed on bedroom floors. The government told everyone this was temporary. Pack a small bag. You'll be back in 3 days. Buses lined up along the main roads that afternoon. Families were told to bring documents, a little food, and nothing else. Pets were left tied outside. Livestock was left in the fields. Nobody locked their doors because nobody thought they needed to. 3 days turned into a week turned into a month. And at some point, without ever announcing it directly, the Soviet government stopped pretending the evacuation was temporary at all. An exclusion zone was drawn on the map, first at a radius of 10 kilometers, then expanded to 30. Inside that boundary sat not just Pripyat, but dozens of smaller villages, farms, and hamlets that most people outside Ukraine have never heard of. To the engineers and scientists managing the disaster, the zone was a containment problem. To the people who had lived there, it was simply home. They never went back. Not officially, but some of them did anyway. Within weeks of the evacuation, a small number of residents began quietly returning to the exclusion zone. Most were older. Many were farmers. Almost all of them shared one thing in common. They had lived through something else before. World War II, the Holodomor famine, Stalin's collectivization. To them, an invisible danger they couldn't see, smell, or feel was, in a strange way, less frightening than the very visible danger of losing everything they had left. One of the most documented of these returnees was a man named Ivan Semenyuk, who came back to his village inside the zone with his wife, Maria. They didn't sneak in through a fence in the night like a thriller movie. They simply walked home, moved back into their house, and started living there again, the way people do. Soviet and later Ukrainian authorities called people like the Semenyuks Samosely. It translates roughly to self-settlers. At first, officials tried to remove them. They failed. There were simply too many, scattered across too wide an area, and most were elderly people the state didn't have the stomach to drag out a second time. Eventually, the government gave up trying to relocate them and instead began quietly tolerating their presence, occasionally even delivering them supplies. The Soviet response wasn't gentle. In the early years, patrols were sent through the zone specifically to find and remove self-settlers. Homes that had been reoccupied were sometimes bulldozed once the residents were forcibly relocated a second time. Some Samosely simply moved to a different empty house in the same village and started again. Others waited until the patrols stopped coming as often, then quietly slipped back in through the same door they had left, sometimes twice. Here's the part that should confuse you. Radiation exposure is supposed to shorten lives. That's not in dispute. High doses cause radiation sickness, and elevated long-term exposure is linked to increased cancer risk. So logically, the people who returned to live inside a radioactive exclusion zone should have fared worse than those who left and rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Multiple researchers who studied the self-settlers found something more complicated. Medical anthropologist Adriana Petrina spent years studying Chernobyl's aftermath and published her findings in the book Life Exposed, examining how the disaster reshaped the way an entire population understood illness, risk, and survival. Her research pointed to something unexpected. Many of the Samosely who returned were not obviously sicker than evacuees who left. In some documented cases, they appeared to be doing better, both physically and mentally. How is that possible? Part of the answer has nothing to do with radiation at all. It has to do with what happens to a person when you take away their home, their land, their community, and their sense of purpose all at once. Evacuees who left the zone were often relocated to unfamiliar cities, housed in cramped apartments, and separated from lifelong neighbors. Many lost access to the gardens and farmland that had structured their daily lives for decades. Sociologist Olga Kuchinskaya, who researched the social and psychological dimensions of the disaster in her work, The Politics of Invisibility, described how displacement itself became its own kind of trauma. Depression, alcoholism, and a documented sense of purposelessness spread through many evacuee communities. communities. Some researchers who studied resettled populations noted that the psychological toll of sudden uprooting rivaled and in some assessments exceeded the measurable physical toll of moderate radiation exposure. Meanwhile, the self-settlers who returned had something the evacuees didn't: a reason to get up in the morning. They tended gardens, they kept chickens, they fixed their own roofs, they lived by choice on their own land, doing the same work their families had done for generations. This isn't a case for ignoring radiation risk. It's a much stranger and more human story about which risks actually shorten a life and which ones we tend to underestimate because they don't show up on a Geiger counter. Doctors who worked with resettled populations noticed the pattern too. Evacuees relocated to unfamiliar apartment blocks often described a kind of grief that had no obvious name. They hadn't lost a person, they had lost a place, and with it, the daily rhythm that had organized their entire lives. Waking up to feed animals that no longer existed, reaching for tools that were left behind, walking toward gardens that were now just an address on a resettlement form. That kind of loss is harder to measure than a radiation dose, but it doesn't mean it weighs less. Public health researchers studying the broader Chernobyl-affected population have pointed out that some of the most severe documented health consequences, outside of the plant workers and emergency responders who received acute doses during the disaster itself, came from stress, displacement, and lifestyle disruption, rather than radiation exposure alone. That finding surprised even people inside the field. It's easier to build a story around an invisible radioactive villain than around the much quieter damage of uprooting an 80-year-old farmer from the only life she has ever known. You might think of the exclusion zone as frozen in 1986. It isn't. Wolves, lynx, and wild horses now roam through Pripyat's crumbling streets in numbers ecologists didn't expect. Trees grow through the floors of the old amusement park that never opened, and scattered among all of it, a shrinking number of Samosely, most now in their 80s and 90s, still wake up, walk out to their gardens, and go on with the ordinary business of living. Journalist and filmmaker Holly Morris spent years documenting these women for a project that became known as the Babushkas of Chernobyl, following residents like Hannah Zavorotnya, who returned to her home inside the zone decades before the film was made. Zavorotnya famously said that radiation would not steal what the war and the famine had already failed to take from her. To her, staying wasn't recklessness, it was continuity. It was refusing to let an invisible force finish what visible ones had already tried to do. Life inside the zone settled into an unlikely rhythm of its own. Some Samosely villages had a single delivery van that came through once or twice a week, bringing bread and basic supplies. Neighbors who had known each other since childhood were now scattered across a landscape with almost no cars, no working phone lines for years, and no young families. Funerals became a regular part of zone life, not from radiation sickness, but simply from age, since most of the returnees were already in their 60s and 70s by the time they moved back. Despite the isolation, visitors and researchers who spent time in these villages often described something unexpected: laughter, hospitality, homebrewed vodka offered to strangers, and an almost stubborn cheerfulness. Hannah Zavorotnya and her neighbors were known for singing together, tending vegetable patches that produced food they knew, on some level, carried trace contamination, and choosing to eat it anyway rather than depend entirely on outside deliveries. Most of the original self-settlers have since died, simply of old age, the way people everywhere eventually do. The population that remains is small and aging further every year. Ukrainian officials estimate only a handful are left today, living in villages with no shops, no doctors, and no neighbors under 60. And yet, here's the detail that keeps researchers coming back to this story. Comparative health studies looking at Chernobyl area populations have consistently struggled to draw a simple, direct line between exclusion zone residency and dramatically shortened lifespan among the Samosely specifically. The picture is messier than radiation equals death, or returning home equals health. It's a story about competing risks, and about how the human need for purpose, land, and belonging can push back, at least partially, against a threat we usually assume should override everything else. There's a broader pattern here too, one that shows up again and again whenever disasters force mass relocation. After the 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan, researchers studying elderly evacuees found a similar phenomenon. Some of the sharpest declines in health came not from radiation exposure itself, but from the disruption of relocation, particularly among older residents moved out of nursing facilities and long-term homes. It's a pattern serious enough that some public health researchers researchers have begun questioning whether evacuation policy, in certain edge cases involving elderly populations and low-level contamination, should weigh the psychological and physical cost of displacement as heavily as it weighs the radiological risk of staying. None of this makes returning to Chernobyl safe in any simple sense. The soil and parts of the zone will remain contaminated for generations. Certain areas are still genuinely dangerous, and the reactor itself remains sealed beneath a massive steel containment structure completed decades after the disaster specifically to prevent further leakage. Nobody studying the Samosely is arguing that radiation doesn't matter. What they're arguing is something more unsettling. That risk isn't just a number on a dosimeter. It's also uprooting, loneliness, depression, and the loss of purpose. And those forces can shorten a life just as surely as radiation can, even though nobody hands you a warning label for them. Chernobyl is often used as shorthand for disaster, for the worst thing nuclear technology can do, and it deserves that reputation. But buried inside that catastrophe is a much quieter story that gets far less attention. A small number of people who looked at an officially uninhabitable zone, weighed it against the alternative of leaving everything behind, and chose the radiation. Not because they didn't understand the danger, because they understood something else about survival that the rest of us often forget. A life measured only in years isn't the same as a life worth living, so maybe the real question was never why they went back. Maybe it's why we assume that leaving was ever the safer choice.